The Romanist, he says, faces this dilemma. Quote, if man's reason is competent to tell that God's goodness implies the provision of a supernatural revelation, it needs no such revelation, being able to decide equally well what man's own attainment of good requires. If it is incompetent to point the way to human salvation, it is still more incompetent to conclude anything about infinite providence. Page 454, first edition. Now, there may be flaws, and serious flaws, in the Thomistic philosophy, but Professor Burt's criticism seems to miss the mark. It may seem strange that a discussion which will arrive at a thoroughgoing rejection of Thomism should pause to defend it against contemporary attacks. Yet not only should one try to be fair, but even self-interest cautions against relying on defective criticisms, and indeed it seems that Professor Burt has placed a burden on Thomism that it need not bear. In the first place, it is not necessary to hold that God's goodness implies a supernatural revelation. It is enough that God's goodness permits the possibility of a revelation. Of course, God might show his goodness in other ways, as Burt contends, but this does not rationally exclude a special revelation. Then in the second place, even if God's goodness implied a special revelation, it by no means follows that unaided reason could discover the contents of that revelation. Granting unreservedly that from God's goodness we could validly infer that there must be a revelation, granting that is that we recognize the need of further information as to the method of obtaining our ultimate felicity, there is still no reason to conclude that this information is discoverable by our unaided efforts. Quite the contrary. Would it not be largely our own inability to discover God's requirements for us that led us in the first place to conclude for the necessity of revelation? Burt's criticism relies wholly on the principle that if it is possible to demonstrate any one proposition, it is possible to demonstrate all others. This is implausible. There is nothing irrational or self-contradictory, certainly nothing obviously self-contradictory, in maintaining the demonstrability of some truths and the indemonstrability of others. Even Hegel, who by the exigencies of his system should have made everything demonstrable, admitted the existence of contingencies in nature. In Hegel's construction, this admission may indeed be a flaw. Absolute idealism presupposes that all knowledge is so interrelated that every part entails the whole. All nature is supposed to be grasped through a dialectical manifestation of concepts that is completely under our control. But Thomism is not Hegelianism. If with Thomas the premises of demonstration are to be sought in sensory experience, each man is limited by the relatively narrow range of his own experience, and all mankind would be limited by a universe of experience that does not include premises for all truths. Without these premises, we cannot possibly arrive at the desired conclusions. Intricate epistemological considerations enter here that cannot be discussed just now, but, at least from a more ordinary point of view, the inability to demonstrate the events of history does not seem to invalidate the proof of the theorems in geometry. Burt then makes the supposition that the Romanist, in answer to the criticisms that any rational competency makes revelation unnecessary, would point to the Bible as being in fact a revelation. But Burt holds this is an inadequate reply to the criticism. Quote, acceptance of any supposed revelation as an actual fact depends upon the prior conviction that there is in the universe a God able and willing to supply it. Page 406, Revised Edition. This assertion also is wide of the mark, but in one respect it better describes the position than the earlier dilemma. The dilemma depended on the point that an argument for God's existence would imply a revelation. That is to say, Burt first contended that a demonstration of God's existence, if further continued, would also demonstrate the existence and the contents of a revelation. This later remark merely insists that a conviction of God's existence must precede the acceptance of a revelation.